Welcome to Writing and Teaching with the Drew Writing Project and Digital Literacies Collaborative. Today, we will be discussing active listening. I'm your host, Kristen Turner, Director of the DWP-DLC, and I'm joined by two of our teacher consultants, Shannon Faulkner and Gary Pankowitz. Shannon and Gary have been collaborating across schools for almost a year now, and this is the next step in their collaboration. So you've been working on creating modules on active listening. Can you start by telling us about active listening and what it is and why it's important?
Sure. Active listening, we sort of distinguish between active listening and critical listening. So most of us think that, we should be critical listeners. We're listening to evaluate, make judgments, notice discrepancies, and that skill set certainly has a place, but active listening is sort of the step maybe before critical listening, or maybe even a more important thing than critical listening, in the sense that in active listening, we're really just kind of trying to be present in the moment and hear what the other person has to say. We're not goal oriented. We're not trying to, achieve anything yet. We're just taking in information. And we're doing it with the attitude of acceptance and the desire to understand. So the motivating force for us when we're listening actively is that understanding. So we're not looking to evaluate or make judgments. We're actually just trying to understand what the other person is saying. So you can see this obviously has some benefits in sort of interpersonal relationships, because that's how we develop empathy and get to know one another and feel connected to one another. But also in academic contexts, that first we want students to have the fullest understanding possible of concepts before they take that leap into making judgments and evaluations.
Can you
So I can add also that, I learned so much from listening to Shannon's portion of the module and really thinking about critical listening versus active listening. In particular, how in critical listening, I think that's something I've always supported as a teacher, right? We're trying to ask our students to evaluate text, to evaluate the speaker, to think about tone. But to think that, we can go into another realm and think about the act of listening in terms of trying to just be present within the moment. Think about connectedness with the speaker or the text and how that can contribute to just being a better listener. That was really helpful to me.
I'm hearing, as you two are talking about these lessons and these ideas, that there's an underlying kind of basis of building empathy through active listening. So can you say a little bit more about the role of empathy, which we know is connected to social emotional learning, but is that coming out in the lessons that you've been designing?
Yes, ideally these lessons would be done in classrooms, perhaps early in the year, as the teachers building community within the classroom, and students are getting to know one another. Because one of the things that active listening does is allows us to more fully understand another person's perspective. We talk in the module about different types of empathy, but in particular, the idea of social empathy. We can't really connect to another person's feelings and understand their perspective if we're not hearing their story, if we're not hearing their ideas, if we're, as that person is talking, we're already in our head formulating responses. We're not actually getting that person's full story. We're still kind of focused on the self. So active listening is very much about turning our focus fully toward that other person, taking in everything that person has to say, without sort of being up here in our own brains trying to figure out, well, what am I going to say in response, or how am I going to respond, or how am I going to follow up what this person is saying. We're just focused on being in that moment, which is actually a really difficult skill, even for most of us as adults. So, but a useful skill. So something that we definitely want students to be working on.
Exactly. I mean, I think just thinking about critical listening and how in class, it's not uncommon to ask students to think about putting themselves in someone else's shoes to try to embrace empathy. And what Shannon taught me was that was more cognitive empathy. But what we were also working towards within this module was thinking about that social empathy. And in order to do that, you have to have that active listening where you're present and trying to connect with the other person in your conversation and in your listening skills. So that was really helpful as well.
This takes me back to John Dewey and the idea of reflection, but then also reflection into reflexivity, where you're not just inside yourself, but you're looking outside yourself and bringing others into who you are to make a change in who you are. So what does this mean for the writing classroom? Like, why active listening for writers that are being developed in the classroom?
So I could say that one thing when we were trying to think, so how can we develop these skills within students? And I think we went to some of our fallback projects that have been successful and thought about how to really explore this element of listening at a different level. So for me, I love the whole idea of found poetry. I love just like sitting as a bystander, listening in to other people, jotting down notes, little excerpts from what I hear and what I feel, and then just rearranging those words in a way that I think makes sense. And I try to make meaning into a found poem. So one of the things we did within this module was we modeled found poetry. And then we were trying to think, what's a good text that students could listen in on and create their own found poem? And we actually found this great interview of Amanda Gorman being interviewed. So that text modeled the whole interview process, but then it just allowed students to listen in and jot down some notes and then rearrange those notes to create their found poem. So not only were they like exploring a great mentor text, but they were also developing meaning by using their listening skills.
I think it's Susan Sontag who has this wonderful quote about what it means to be a writer. And one of the things that she says is that the kind of foundational concept of being a writer is just noticing, just being present and noticing what's happening around you. So it seems like active listening is sort of like the doorway into that capacity. If we want students to be writers, they first have to notice specifics, details, elements of other people's emotions, and then they can draw on those noticings as writers.
Great. So Shannon, do you have any other activities? Gary mentioned the found poem. That sounds like a great activity as part of this module. What other activities would students be doing in your classroom to develop these active listening / developing empathy / developing noticing skills?
Well, the sort of culminating activity is around interviews. And we found an article from advice from Terry Gross, who hosts Fresh Air on NPR. And she's interviewed, hundreds, if not thousands of people during the course of her career. And she gives the suggestion that rather than when you meet someone asking them, what do you do? Where are you from? All of those questions sort of presume certain information to be true. So she says, rather than use those sorts of leading questions, say to someone, tell me about yourself, because that puts the onus on the other person to share with you what they feel is relevant and important about themselves and their identity. So one of the activities is that we have students interviewing one another with that as the opening question. So they don't prepare questions ahead of time and, come in this very prescriptive, scripted way. They actually have to listen to what that person says in response to the prompt, tell me about yourself, and ask those follow-up questions based on what that person is saying during the course of the conversation. So first they sort of practice that with a classmate, and then we ask them to do the same thing with a community member, somebody from their own life or community. And so we're drawing into the classroom all of these different voices as students interview one another and as they interview people that are important in their own lives. So that's helpful too in terms of building out our empathetic muscles, right? We hear more stories, we connect to more people.
I love that idea of empathetic muscles because it is one of the writing muscles, being able to take on that other person's perspective, whether you're writing in a narrative format, taking on a character's perspective, or if you're writing in an argumentative format where you're thinking about who your audience member is and whether you're trying to persuade them or convince them of something. So I really love that concept. Gary, any other activities that you would like to share with us?
Just some of the the fallback ways that we support instruction. So the idea of having students actually jot down notes from the videos, and then after they jot down those notes, to actually reflect on those notes and put those notes in order from what was most important to least important. And in my mind, that's a way to have students not just show that they're comprehending the ideas, but that they go that next step in trying to evaluate the ideas. To me, I've always thought that that helps like concretize the learning and the thinking. Those bullet points that were put in order, that when they put those jotted notes, those became like an anchor chart or a checklist to support the students when they went that next step to try to develop their interviews.
I've heard so many different texts involved in this, some of them multimodal, some of them more traditional where students might be reading, but the idea of listening in on interviews. Shannon, are there any other texts that you're really excited are part of this module?
Yeah, we are asking students to listen to a TED Talk by Chimamanda Adichie called "The Danger of a Single Story." And her message in the TED Talk is largely that she is from Nigeria, and she says that when she tells people she's from Africa, people imagine all kinds of stereotypes, that she's starving, that she comes from a rural area. And these things are not true of her experience. And so her point in the TED Talk is just to say that no one person speaks for an entire group of which they are a part. So we're hoping that in developing active listening skills, students are also starting to get more access to other people's stories and kind of get rid of that idea that there is a single story for any group, that each one of us is kind of speaking from our own very particular situated perspective, which is why we have to listen carefully to one another rather than draw on stereotypes that we might have, gotten from media or from books or from any other experiences that we've had. We want to kind of recognize that everybody's speaking only for themselves, and we can't know their story unless we're being attentive when they're telling it.
Great. So what are your big takeaways from doing this work together?
So I could reiterate just that concept of community, right? So if there's one big reflection from this very challenging pandemic context, it's just how important community is, and how as teachers and teacher writers, we really have to focus on how we're going to rebuild community, especially as we get more opportunities to have face-to-face time. So the idea of students conducting interviews with each other, whether it's face-to-face or remote, and then reflecting on the people who are important in their lives, and them getting a chance to share, their outer communities outside of the school community, and bring those interviews within their school community to just, make an even greater wealth of community. It's really a nice thing that I didn't anticipate it being that monumental, but I really feel like it's going to be pivotal in rebuilding community when people, think through our module.
How about you, Shannon?
I would just add that in some ways there's a civic component to this work, in the sense that we want people to empathize with one another so that we get involved in our communities, that we do the work that needs to happen in some of our communities. So in order to kind of plug into networks of community action, we have to be motivated to do that. We have to understand how people are impacted by systems. So I think that doing some of this active listening work and gathering stories, if we want to think of it in that way, in a way that really seeks to understand stories, not just to hear them and dismiss them, is a way of kind of creating that kind of civic empathy as well.
It seems to me that this work is certainly interdisciplinary, and although you're coming at it from the perspective of writing teachers in the English language arts classrooms, that it really could be spread across the disciplines to all classrooms, to think about active listening and hearing what others are saying, but then also making that turn into civic oriented action.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for sharing. Any last thoughts?
We hope teachers enjoy the module and that students get a lot out of it and build their communities.
Yeah, and just I learned so much, so I'm hoping that other people have things to learn and glean from this work as well.
Well, thank you for sharing and allowing us to see behind the scenes at the thinking that goes into creating some lessons, in this case on active listening. I appreciate your being here today. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
You.